What if the colonial powers never shaped everything we know about modern Europe? What if Africa's resources, culture, and land never became the playground of European nations? What would Europe look like today? Welcome to What If History channel. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to help this small channel along its journey to 10,000 subscribers. The 19th and early 20th centuries were pivotal in shaping Europe's modern power, wealth, and influence. It was during this time that European nations expanded across the globe, establishing vast empires and carving up continents like Africa and Asia to fuel their ambitions. But what if none of this had happened? What if the European powers had never set foot on African soil, had never taken control of its lands, its people, its resources? How different would Europe's trajectory have been? Would it still have risen to the power it holds today? Or would it have remained a collection of fractured states, each struggling to carve out its place in the world? Would the world as we know it have taken a different shape entirely? In this thought experiment, we're not just pondering what Europe might have looked like without its colonial exploits. We're questioning the very foundation of its modern power and influence. We'll explore the ripple effects of this alternate timeline, where Europe's wealth, industrial progress, and global dominance were not built on the backs of Africa's resources and people. Could Europe have achieved the same industrialization without Africa's gold, ivory, and rubber? Would European nations have risen to power in the same way? Or would other regions, perhaps Asia or the Americas, have taken the lead instead? Today, we're going to take you through an alternate history, imagining a world where Europe never colonized Africa. We'll examine what might have happened to Africa, untouched by the exploitative systems of colonization, and how that would have reshaped Europe's path to power. What would global trade look like? What would the balance of power be in the world today? These are questions we'll explore together. This isn't just about Europe. It's about how two continents, Africa and Europe, were shaped by historical forces beyond their control. We'll walk through pivotal moments in history, analyzing how Europe's imperial conquests altered its destiny and the destinies of millions. But in this version of history, those changes didn't happen, and the future unfolded differently. The answers might surprise you as we uncover the unimaginable consequences of a world where European powers never set foot in Africa. By the end of this video, we'll uncover how both Africa and Europe might have evolved along vastly different paths, untouched by colonial influence. Could Africa have become a global powerhouse on its own, without European interference? Could Europe have still become the technological and economic giant it is today? You'll be shocked by the implications of this thought experiment, and you'll have to reconsider everything you know about history. This is a journey through an alternate reality you've never considered before. Before we jump into the story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think Africa would have evolved without European influence? Drop your ideas and theories in the comments below. Let's see how many different perspectives we can gather on this incredible alternate history. If you're enjoying this exploration of alternate history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're just getting started. There's a lot more to uncover. In the early 15th century, Europe was on the cusp of a transformative shift. The foundations of the age of exploration were being laid as European powers sought to expand their influence, driven by the pursuit of wealth, trade, and military power. But these ambitions were not the result of Europe's natural riches or resources alone. The world was about to change in ways no one could have fully predicted, and the catalyst for this change was a seemingly endless treasure trove of resources found just beyond Europe's shores, Africa. Picture the vast African kingdoms, Mali with its legendary wealth from gold, Egypt, the cradle of ancient civilization, and the mighty great Zimbabwe, known for its intricate stone architecture and control over vast trade routes. These civilizations, untouched by European influence, were brimming with resources, history, and culture. And yet, during this period of European expansion, Africa was not simply a distant neighbor. It was a continent with vast, unexplored riches, standing as a tantalizing prize for European powers. But what if Africa had remained untouched? What if European explorers had never set sail to exploit the wealth of these nations? How would the course of history have changed, not just for Europe but for the entire world? What would have happened to the ambitions of rising European nations like Spain, Portugal, and later, England and France, if Africa's vast resources hadn't been factored into the equation. Let's take a moment to explore the history that never happened. If Europe had never laid claim to Africa, would its explosive growth during the Industrial Revolution have even been possible? This revolution, which was built upon the exploitation of raw materials like gold, rubber, and ivory from Africa, sparked an unprecedented transformation in Europe. The question remains, without these resources, what would Europe have done to fuel its growing industries? In this alternate timeline, without the influx of African wealth, Europe might have been forced to look inward. Its natural resources, while abundant in some regions, were not enough to meet the demands of the rapidly expanding industrial economy. Would Europe have been able to develop the same technological advancements without access to Africa's vast gold mines, diamond fields, and rubber trees? The development of railways, machinery, and even weapons would have been a slower, more localized affair. The steel industry, which helped shape modern Europe, would have faced significant delays without the influx of raw materials crucial to its expansion. Europe might have turned to other regions for these resources. Asia, with its extensive trade networks, might have become Europe's focus. The Silk Road, which had long connected Europe to China and India, could have seen even more prominent trade and exploration routes, accelerating European interest in the East. However, Asia had its complexities and challenges. Trade routes were already well established, and local powers like the Ottoman Empire controlled much of the access. So would Europe have had the same unencumbered access to the resources it craved? Would the East have been able to fulfill Europe's growing demands, or would the lack of direct control have led to more aggressive conflicts, even earlier than we saw in the 18th century? Without Africa to exploit, Europe's global expansion would have likely been focused on consolidating power closer to home. Nations like Spain and Portugal may have turned inward, strengthening their hold over their existing colonies in the Americas, or they may have sought to expand further into South Asia and the Indian Ocean. This would have meant less focus on the Atlantic slave trade, the exploitation of African agricultural resources, and the accumulation of wealth that came from controlling Africa's natural resources. These factors were essential to the rapid development of European infrastructure. Without them, it's unclear if the continent could have risen to the global dominance it held by the 19th century. Now let's look at the Industrial Revolution itself, a key turning point in European history. The extraction of raw materials from Africa wasn't just a footnote in Europe's rise to power. It was central to the entire process. Without the gold, diamonds, and rubber that fueled European industries, the technological innovations that sparked the industrial age might have been delayed for decades. Railroads, steam engines, and mechanized factories all relied on raw materials that came from the heart of Africa. And without access to these resources, Europe's path to industrialization would have faced significant barriers. Let's take rubber as an example. This versatile material was essential to Europe's industrial expansion, particularly in the production of tires and machinery. The Belgian Congo and other parts of Africa were sources of rubber that European factories desperately needed. If Africa had remained untouched, the rubber trade would have been far less profitable, and Europe's automobile and transportation industries might have developed at a much slower pace. The same goes for the gold from Mali and the diamond mines of South Africa, which were essential to Europe's expanding economy and global influence. Would Europe have been able to achieve the same wealth and power without these treasures from Africa? In a world without Africa's influence, the political landscape would have shifted too. Nations like Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal might have turned inward, consolidating their hold on territories in the Americas rather than competing for power in Africa. This would have likely resulted in a world where Europe's colonial dominance remained focused on the Western Hemisphere, with fewer global conflicts, but perhaps more tension within Europe itself. Could Europe's internal political conflicts have been more intense if the competition for Africa's wealth had been eliminated? Would European nations have gone to war for different reasons, or would their rivalries have remained more localized? The absence of African exploitation would have also had a profound impact on the African continent itself. Without the destructive influence of European colonization, African kingdoms like Mali, Songhai, and Great Zimbabwe could have evolved in entirely different ways. The flow of wealth, ideas, and culture would have stayed within Africa, potentially leading to a continent that was more unified, with stronger regional powers competing for influence rather than being divided by colonial borders and foreign domination. African kingdoms could have become global powers in their own right, shaping the modern world in ways that we can only imagine. Could Europe have developed at the same pace without Africa's vast wealth of resources? Would European nations have still risen to global power? Let me know your thoughts on this alternate history. How do you think Europe would have evolved without Africa's influence? Drop your ideas and insights in the comments below, and let's discuss how different the world could have been. By taking a deep look into the early stages of European expansion and imagining a world without Africa's resources, we understand just how intertwined Africa's history has been with the rise of Europe. The absence of Africa would have meant more than just a lack of economic growth for Europe. It would have altered the entire course of global history. Africa was home to some of the world's most powerful and advanced civilizations, long before European colonialism redefined its course. Stretching across vast deserts, lush jungles, and sprawling savannas, Africa's ancient civilizations, like Egypt, Mali, Songhai, and the Zulu Kingdom, left an indelible mark on history. These societies were sophisticated, not only in their governance and social structures, but also in their art, trade, and technology. Take, for example, the Mali Empire, which at its peak was one of the wealthiest civilizations in the world. Its capital, Timbuktu, was a global center of learning, with scholars from all over Africa and the Arab world coming together to exchange ideas on science, mathematics, and astronomy. Mali was also famous for its gold wealth, making it an indispensable player in the global economy of the time. Similarly, the Songhai Empire was a dominant force in West Africa, controlling trade routes that stretched across the Sahara and into Europe. The Great Zimbabwe was home to a complex civilization known for its advanced stone architecture and control over extensive trade networks. And then there's ancient Egypt, which pioneered monumental achievements in engineering, medicine, and writing, influencing not just Africa but the entire world. Had European powers not arrived on Africa's shores, what might these civilizations have achieved? Could they have developed even more advanced technologies? Could Africa have become a more united continent, where powerful kingdoms and empires traded knowledge and resources freely, instead of being divided by the arbitrary borders drawn by colonial rulers? What we know is that Africa was a place of immense potential, and the civilizations that thrived here were on the verge of even greater accomplishments. But colonial interference disrupted that potential in ways that we are still dealing with today. The African continent was rich in culture, history, and natural resources that Europeans would exploit for centuries. But what if Africa had been allowed to evolve without this interruption? How might its nations have progressed technologically, politically, and economically without the hindrance of European colonization? If Africa had been able to continue its growth uninterrupted, its resources, like the vast deposits of gold in South Africa, the incredible agricultural potential in Nigeria, and the abundant mineral wealth in Congo, could have fueled even more rapid development. Just as Europe underwent an industrial revolution, Africa too could have seen a technological revolution. Imagine African civilizations developing their own industrial capabilities, using their natural resources to build their infrastructure, advance technology, and boost economic development. In politics too, Africa might have evolved very differently. Many of the pre-colonial African kingdoms operated under highly sophisticated political systems. For instance, the Zulu Kingdom in southern Africa had a centralized monarchy and a military elite that was incredibly organized, able to hold off European invasions for years. The Mali Empire was known for its wealth, but also for its system of governance that incorporated checks and balances, as well as public consultation. With no colonial interference, African societies would have been free to strengthen and refine their political systems, potentially avoiding the violent power struggles and corruption that have plagued many African nations post-independence. The diverse cultures, languages, and traditions that existed in harmony could have formed a more cohesive political identity across the continent, potentially leading to a United States of Africa long before the modern movement of Pan-Africanism emerged in the 20th century. In short, Africa was positioned to continue its growth into an economic and political powerhouse. Without the scars of colonization, what could Africa have looked like by the 20th century? Would it have emerged as a global power on the world stage, just as Europe and North America did? The possibilities are astounding. By the turn of the 20th century, Africa's rich history and vast resources could have made it a formidable player in the global economic system. With no colonial borders dividing its peoples, African nations could have consolidated their power and wealth, forming trading blocs and alliances that could challenge the global dominance of Europe and the United States. Think about it. Without colonial powers carving up Africa and exploiting its people and resources for their benefit, African nations could have developed stable, independent political systems that promoted growth and prosperity. South Africa's rich mineral resources, for example, could have been harnessed to create a highly industrialized nation. At the same time, West African empires, with their deep trade routes and advanced knowledge, could have become intellectual and economic hubs in the global community. In terms of global power, Africa could have found its place among the world's great powers. With its vast territory, abundant natural resources, and highly developed societies, it's conceivable that Africa could have competed on the same level as European and North American powers. Even if Africa hadn't been a dominant force militarily, it could have been an economic superpower. Consider the major role that China is now playing in global affairs. In this alternate history, Africa could have played a similar role, leveraging its immense resources and vast landmass to establish itself as a primary player in world trade, science, and culture. What if Africa's greatest civilizations continued uninterrupted? Could Africa have risen as a global power in the 20th century, reshaping the modern world in ways we've never considered? Would Africa have avoided the political instability and economic exploitation that came with colonization? How different would our world be today if Africa's civilizations had been allowed to flourish without interruption? I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's imagine an Africa that wasn't divided, that wasn't exploited, and that charted its own path in the world. How do you think that would have impacted global history? The Industrial Revolution, a transformative period in Europe's history, is often seen as the defining moment that propelled the continent into modernity. It was an era marked by rapid technological innovation, the rise of factory systems, and the birth of mass production. But behind this surge in growth was a darker reality: Africa. Europe's industrial boom was powered by resources drawn from the heart of Africa: gold, rubber, ivory, and most importantly, cheap labor. So what happens to Europe's development if that resource flow never existed? If you're enjoying this exploration of alternate history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're just getting started because there's a lot more to uncover. Without Africa's vast wealth of raw materials, Europe would have faced significant challenges in its industrial progress. To understand this, let's focus on one key component: raw materials. The rubber harvested from Africa's vast forests was essential for the production of tires, machinery, and early automobiles. Gold and diamonds plundered from Africa's mines financed European banking systems, fueling the growth of industries and infrastructure. The continent's vast agricultural wealth, such as cocoa, palm oil, and cotton, also fed European sectors, providing the raw goods for textile mills and food production. But what if these resources never made their way to Europe? The manufacturing capacity that Europe developed would have been delayed. The technological leaps that were so critical in shaping modern Europe, such as steam engines, railroads, and automated textile machines, might have faced major hurdles. The British Empire, which became the world's largest economic powerhouse, would have found it much harder to fund and sustain its rapid industrial growth without the gold from South Africa or rubber from Congo. Without Africa's contribution, could Europe have transitioned from an agrarian society to an industrial one as quickly as it did? Or would the Industrial Revolution have unfolded at a much slower pace, forcing Europe to remain dependent on traditional industries longer than expected? The consequences would not have been limited to industry alone. European nations may have struggled to gain the necessary wealth and resources to fund the infrastructure required to become global superpowers. Without the financial backing from African resources, Europe's rise to dominance might likely have been much less pronounced. This absence would have left Europe more vulnerable to economic slowdowns, possibly delaying the development of cities, railways, and technological innovations. In a world without Africa, Europe's industrial story would have been much slower, and the global landscape would look very different today. Along with industry, Europe's technological and military advancements were crucial to its rise. The idea of European dominance on the world stage, from the military prowess of nations like Britain, France, and Spain, to the technological innovations that changed the way wars were fought, would have looked drastically different without Africa's contributions. Let's start with military dominance. The resources that Africa provided were not just raw materials for European industry, they were also essential to maintaining Europe's military superiority. Gold allowed European powers to fund expensive military campaigns, rubber was used in the production of military gear, and African labor helped support the infrastructure needed for military expansion. European powers, especially Britain, were able to establish vast colonial empires through military force, and this was funded and supported by the wealth taken from Africa. But what if Africa had remained unconquered, its wealth untapped? Would Europe have expanded in the same way? Without the financial gains from colonialism, European nations would have been far less equipped to wage the wars that built empires. Instead of a global military presence, Europe might have remained more focused on internal struggles and regional conflicts, unable to sustain the kind of global dominance they came to enjoy. What about technology? The influx of African resources propelled Europe's advancements in fields like transportation, communication, and manufacturing. The development of steamships, which helped to create global trade networks, also depended on Africa's resources. And consider the rise of automobile technology. Could the world's first cars have been built without access to rubber from Africa's plantations? If Europe had to rely on its own resources, technological advancements would have been slower, and the global competition for innovation would have looked very different. In this alternative history, Europe might not have been the first mover in many technological fields, giving rise to new competitors from other parts of the world. Without the wealth of Africa to fuel its expansion, Europe would have had to look elsewhere for resources and trade routes. Asia, with its long history of advanced civilizations and existing trade networks, might have become an even more important partner for Europe. European powers, driven by their hunger for raw materials, would have turned their attention to India, China, and the East Indies for trade. The Silk Road, which had long served as a vital link between East and West, might have been even more central to Europe's global strategy, pushing European explorers and traders deeper into Asia. The expansion of European powers into Asia would not have been without challenges. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled key trade routes between Europe and Asia, might have become an even more dominant player in this alternate timeline. European nations, lacking the wealth from Africa, would have had to form stronger alliances with regional powers in Asia, potentially altering the course of history. The British Empire might have focused even more on its presence in India, trying to maintain its dominance in the region without the financial backing of African colonies. In this world, European trade with Africa's raw materials might have been replaced by more complex and competitive trade relations with Asian markets. But would this have been enough to sustain Europe's growth? Would the Americas, with their newly established colonies, have become a greater focus for European powers, who might have turned to the West in search of resources? Without Africa's gold and rubber, European powers would have turned to alternative trade routes, perhaps pushing harder into South America for the wealth of Brazil, or trying to establish new networks in North America. This could have led to an even earlier competition between Europe and the emerging powers of the New World, such as the United States and Brazil, for control over the wealth and resources of the Americas. Imagine Europe's military and technological advancements without the wealth of Africa fueling them. Would Europe have risen to global dominance as quickly as it did? Would new powers have emerged to challenge Europe's military supremacy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. How would the absence of Africa's resources have shaped the history of Europe's technological and military prowess? Let's discuss how this alternate history would have played out. The absence of colonialism would have fundamentally reshaped the global power dynamic in ways we can hardly imagine. For centuries, the exploitation of Africa was central to the rise of European powers. Europe's dominance on the world stage was built in large part on its access to Africa's wealth. gold, diamonds, rubber, and human labor. But without this treasure trove of resources to fuel European expansion, the course of history would have taken an entirely different turn. So what would the world have looked like if Africa had never been colonized? For one, other regions might have risen to prominence much sooner. Could we have seen China or India become the dominant global powers earlier than expected? Both areas were already home to ancient and advanced civilizations long before European colonization took hold. India, with its thriving trade networks, had already established itself as a key player in global commerce. China, with its dynastic empires and strategic innovations, had built a powerful and vast civilization. Without the colonial distraction, Europe may have found it more challenging to maintain its dominance in global trade. As Africa remained unconquered, other regions would have had more freedom to develop. The Silk Road, which had been a critical trade route between East and West, could have taken on even greater significance. China, with its vast population, resources, and technological advancements, might have expanded its influence over Europe much sooner, possibly shifting the power balance entirely. What would have happened if India had remained more connected to its trade networks without the interference of European colonial forces? Could it have developed into a dominant superpower, drawing on its rich cultural and economic history? Without the drain of European exploitation, India's potential for global influence could have been unleashed, shifting the power structure much earlier. The absence of European colonialism in Africa could have allowed the East to reclaim its historical role at the center of the global stage, with both China and India vying for economic and political supremacy. Now let's consider the economic impact. For centuries, Africa's resources were systematically extracted and shipped off to European shores. This exploitation provided Europe with the raw materials needed to fuel its industrial revolution. But what if Africa had remained independent, untouched by the colonial machine? How would global economies look today? Without the pillaging of Africa, the wealth generated from the continent would have remained within Africa itself, potentially transforming it into a major economic powerhouse. Instead of being seen as a region to exploit, Africa could have emerged as a strong trading partner for the world. Africa's immense natural resources, gold, diamonds, oil, rubber, cocoa, and countless others, could have provided the foundation for an independent and prosperous continent. Imagine a scenario where Africa's wealth was used to build strong domestic economies. Trade relationships with Europe, Asia, and the Americas could have been built on equal footing, rather than the one-sided exploitation we saw in reality. Africa might have developed its own industries, advanced infrastructure, and technology, placing it on a path to self-sufficiency and global economic influence. By the 20th century, Africa could have been a central player in the global economy. Without the divisions caused by colonial borders, nations could have formed stronger economic alliances, boosting their political leverage on the world stage. As a result, Africa might have been better positioned to influence global trade, banking, and investment, shifting the balance of economic power. Instead of being a source of cheap labor and raw materials for Europe, Africa could have harnessed its own resources for economic growth and industrialization. The impact of colonization was not just economic. It also shaped Africa's cultural and political systems. Colonial powers imposed their own cultures, languages, and systems of governance on African societies, leaving deep scars that are still felt today. Without colonial interference, Africa could have evolved very differently, both in terms of its cultural identity and political structure. Africa's rich and diverse cultures, each with its own history, traditions, and systems of governance, might have had the space to flourish without the imposition of foreign rule. Traditional African systems of governance, such as the village councils of the Zulu or the more complex hierarchies of the Mali Empire, could have been further refined and strengthened. These systems, often more decentralized and community-oriented than their European counterparts, could have provided the foundation for more democratic and stable political systems within Africa. Politically, Africa could have developed into a more unified continent, possibly avoiding the fractured, conflict-ridden post-colonial states that we know today. Pan-Africanism, the idea of unity and cooperation across African nations, might have emerged earlier, resulting in a stronger, more cohesive political bloc. Rather than being divided by colonial borders drawn without regard for ethnic or cultural realities, African nations could have formed natural alliances based on shared histories and values. In Europe, the absence of African exploitation would have meant fewer resources to fuel internal rivalries and imperial ambitions. European conflicts like the Napoleonic Wars or World War I might have looked different, as the competition for African resources would have been non-existent. Europe would still have been engaged in rivalries. Still, without the wealth to sustain massive empires, the nature of European conflicts could have been less focused on territorial control and more on other forms of competition, like technological or economic supremacy. And what about global conflicts? Could the tensions that led to World War I and World War II have been less intense if colonialism had never occurred? In these wars, Europe's colonial empires played a key role, both as military suppliers and economic engines. Without the exploitation of Africa, Europe might not have been as engaged in colonial rivalry, which could have meant less competition over overseas territories. This could have led to fewer wars driven by the need to secure colonies. Still, the global dynamics could have shifted in other ways, with different economic and geopolitical tensions emerging in their place. So, what do you think? How would the global power dynamics have unfolded without the colonial exploitation of Africa? Would China or India have risen to power earlier? Would Africa have become an economic powerhouse? And what about the political stability we often see today? Could Africa have avoided the divisions and conflicts that arose from colonial borders? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Your thoughts could reshape our understanding of this alternate history and its impact on the world we live in today. In the modern world, Europe holds immense power and influence. From its economic dominance to its political influence, Europe has shaped the course of global history for centuries. Major institutions like the European Union, international finance and technology have been largely shaped by European powers, and the continent's ability to exert influence around the world remains undeniable. But the question must be asked, would this dominance have still been possible without the wealth Africa provided? Could Europe have still become the global leader we know today if it had not benefited from the wealth of Africa? Let's reflect on the course of history. The Industrial Revolution that took place in Europe, driving its economic expansion and global influence, was significantly fueled by Africa's wealth. Africa's gold, rubber, and human labor contributed not just to European industrial growth, but to the very building blocks of modern Europe. The infrastructure, the industrial technologies, the military advancements, and the global trade networks that allowed Europe to establish its dominance were underpinned by Africa's resources. What Europe gained in wealth through colonial exploitation allowed it to finance the rise of cities, railways, and even military campaigns that cemented its role as the dominant global power. Without Africa's gold and rubber, would Europe have been able to fund its industrial revolution at the same pace? Would European nations have been able to finance global trade networks? Could they have become technological giants without the essential raw materials Africa provided, like rubber for machines and ivory for luxury products? The reality is that Europe's rise to power, its economic might, and its political strength were intimately tied to the wealth it extracted from Africa. Without that wealth, the Europe we know today could have looked very different. Its dominance could have been delayed or never achieved. The story of modern Europe might have unfolded much more slowly, with other nations perhaps in the East rising to challenge Europe's hegemony much earlier. It's fascinating to consider how a world where Africa was not colonized would have changed Europe's trajectory. Would Europe have remained divided and focused on internal struggles rather than global conquest? Would Germany, for example, have risen to international prominence without the riches flowing into its coffers from African colonies? Would Britain have built its empire and become the global power it was? Or would another continent, another civilization, have taken its place in history? These are questions that speak directly to the heart of how interconnected Africa's resources were with Europe's dominance. What would Africa's future look like if it had never been colonized? This question brings us to an equally compelling thought experiment. Africa, with its immense resources, rich cultures, and advanced historical civilizations, had the potential to shape the world in a much different way. Without European exploitation, Africa could have evolved into a prosperous continent, not just in terms of its natural wealth, but as a political, economic, and cultural force on the world stage. Without colonialism's impact, Africa's rich civilizations, such as those of the Mali Empire, Great Zimbabwe, and ancient Egypt, could have continued to evolve and expand. With their deep knowledge in areas like astronomy, mathematics, and agriculture, these civilizations could have advanced technologically, creating their own innovations that could rival the industrialization happening in Europe. Imagine an Africa that developed infrastructure, industry, and technology at the same time as Europe. Instead of being a source of raw materials for Europe, Africa could have used its own resources to build self-sustaining economies, trade alliances, and powerful nations that shaped global affairs. Could Africa have been a global power today? There's a very real possibility. With its vast population, rich natural resources, and strategic location at the crossroads of the world, Africa could have been positioned as a leader in global politics and economics. Rather than being seen as a continent in need of aid, Africa could have been a central force in shaping the global economy, fostering trade, and leading innovation in industries like agriculture, technology, and even space exploration. The African Union might have been an even more powerful political body, pushing for peace, cooperation, and economic growth across the continent. And as for Africa's global role, imagine the continent as an equal player, in a world where its resources were used to fuel its own growth rather than siphoned off to Europe. Africa could have formed strong alliances with regions like Asia and South America, creating a global economic bloc that could rival anything Europe or the United States could make. The balance of power would have shifted dramatically, leading to a much more multipolar world where Africa played a central role, influencing the course of history in ways we can only imagine. The world's history is full of twists and turns, each event shaping the future in ways that are hard to predict. But as we look back on the colonial legacy, one thing is clear. Colonization fundamentally altered the course of both African and European history. If Africa had never been colonized, the global power dynamics would have been drastically different. One key lesson we can take from this thought experiment is that resources and wealth are not just the physical materials we extract from the earth, they are power. The wealth of a nation or a continent shapes its ability to influence and shape the world around it. Europe, through colonization, amassed power by controlling the resources of other continents, and Africa, rich in those resources, was at the center of it all. In a world where Africa was not colonized, that power balance would have shifted. Another lesson is the importance of sovereignty. The divisions created by colonial borders continue to affect African nations today. Had African civilizations been allowed to remain sovereign and independent, they could have maintained stronger cultural and political unity, avoiding some of the political strife we see today. Instead of being divided by arbitrary borders, African nations could have come together to form stronger political and economic systems, allowing the continent to flourish on its own terms. The global impact of history cannot be overstated. The way nations rise and fall, the way economies grow or falter, is often determined by historical moments, those events that change the course of nations. The colonial era shaped the modern world in ways we are still living with today. But imagining a world where Africa's greatness was allowed to shine, rather than be suppressed, shows us that the future is not always set in stone. History is shaped by the actions of nations, but also by the decisions of individuals, and by the resources that give nations the power to change the world. There is much we can learn from this alternate history. The question remains, what if Africa had been allowed to develop freely, without the interference of European powers? Would we have a different world today? What lessons can we learn from this question to create a future where nations, no matter their size or wealth, can grow and thrive on their own terms? This thought experiment makes us reflect on the deep consequences of colonization. What lessons can we learn, and how do you think history might have played out differently? Could Africa have become a global power? Would Europe have reached the heights it did without Africa's wealth? Let me know your thoughts below. Your ideas could help reshape our understanding of history and its long-lasting effects on the present. If you enjoyed exploring this alternate history with me, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a video. Let's keep the conversation going and continue exploring the past in new and exciting ways.